Sleep Ship Archive. Transmission initiated. Vessel status stable. All primary systems nominal. Cryosleep monitoring nominal. Archive integrity confirmed. Voyage year 214. Tonight's record comes from the ocean survey files of old Earth. The subject, the ocean currents. The circulation systems that moved water continuously across the surface and through the depths of the global ocean, carrying heat and dissolved material and everything the water had gathered, across distances no living thing could traverse in a single lifetime. This record is preserved for the colonists aboard this vessel, for those who will one day need to understand what it means to be in motion within something larger than themselves. What it feels like to be carried by a direction that exists independent of the individual. What it means to be in a system and not an event. You may rest now. The archive will do the work of the night. You do not need to move. The water is already moving. You are in the water. These are the only facts required. This is the first thing the ocean teaches, and it teaches it before the mind has a chance to form a question. Direction already exists. It exists in the medium you are in. It does not require you to create it or find it or maintain it. You simply need to be in the water, and the water will carry you in the direction it is already going, not drifting, being carried. The distinction is in the direction. Drifting implies a loss of direction, a passivity that is also a kind of failure, the thing that happens when no force is acting. Being carried means the direction is already established and real, and you are inside it. The current is not taking you somewhere random. It is going where it has been going continuously for longer than anything that has ever lived in the ocean. You are in that. The ocean of old Earth moved in currents, patterns of motion embedded in the water that were as structural as the basin the ocean filled. Not events that happened and then stopped. Not the kind of motion that requires a source and runs out when the source is spent. The currents were the permanent state of the ocean. They were what the ocean was, not what the ocean occasionally did, but the ongoing condition of the ocean. The water was always in them, and they were invisible. You could not see a current from above the water. The surface gave nothing away. The color of the water was the color of the sky reflected, not the color of what moved below. The texture of the surface, where wind was absent, was uniform. The current was not a mark on the water, it was a motion in it. The body in that water felt it differently than the eye could see it. A subtle pressure that was not pressure. A directional quality to the medium. A sense that the water had a preference. A warmth that was not the warmth of sun on skin, but something carried in the water itself. Heat that had traveled with the current from a warmer latitude, that had been in the water long enough to be the water's temperature rather than an addition to it. A sense of going without any sensation of effort. The direction exists before you. You do not need to begin. You are already in motion. The surface currents of old Earth began where the sun was most direct, in the tropics, in the wide equatorial band where the sun arrived overhead rather than at an angle, where the ocean absorbed more energy per square meter than it could radiate back. The water accumulated heat, not indefinitely. The excess moved. The physics of the system required it. The Gulf Stream was the largest and most studied of the surface currents. It began in the Gulf of Mexico. The shallow, warm, enclosed water of the Gulf absorbed solar energy at a rate that exceeded what the basin could hold, and the overflow moved northward through the Florida Strait along the eastern margin of the North American continent. Not fast in any absolute sense. but fast by the standard of ocean water. At its core, it moved at approximately 2 meters per second, faster than walking, far slower than any land vehicle, unmeasurable as speed to a body inside it. It was not a river. Calling it a river was a convenience, a way of giving the mind something to hold: direction, flow, coherence, persistence. But a river is bounded by land. The banks of a river are what make it a river, the solid border that defines the path and holds the water to it. Remove the banks and the river ceases to be a river. It becomes a tendency in the water, a preference, a direction the water has without anything to hold it there except its own properties. The current had no banks. It was defined entirely from within, warmer than the Atlantic to its right, moving where the water around it was not, rotating over hundreds of kilometers with the deflection of the Earth's spin. The same Coriolis effect that curved every moving thing on the planet's surface, pressing the current slightly away from a straight line, bending it east across the open Atlantic as it moved north. The current curved because the planet turned. The planet turned because it had been turning since before any ocean existed. The current followed. The boundary of the current was a temperature gradient, a place where warm became less warm across a few hundred meters of horizontal distance. Not a wall, not a line, a tendency in the water to be one thing, and then gradually another, and then different enough that a body in the water would know it had moved from one into the other. A river inside the ocean. The banks were made of temperature. The edge of the Gulf Stream was one of the sharpest temperature boundaries in the ocean. Oceanographers called it a front, a narrow zone where two water masses with different temperatures met, and the difference between them was more abrupt than gradual mixing would produce. At the edge of the Gulf Stream, the change was measurable in meters: 3 degrees, 4 degrees, 5, across a horizontal distance you could cross with a few strokes. The body in the water feels this. On the warm side, the temperature of the current, which had traveled from the Gulf of Mexico carrying the accumulated heat of the tropics. Not hot, not uncomfortable, but warm in the specific way that water warmed by distance is warm. A fullness to it, a quality. The water feels like it has arrived from somewhere, as if the warmth inside it has been carried a long way and arrived still intact. Cross the line. The cold arrives without transition, not the cold of wind or shade. The cold of a different body of water. Water that has been at this latitude for a different amount of time, under different conditions. The warmth simply ends. The skin registers not a new sensation, but the absence of the previous one. And the boundary of the body becomes present again. The edge of the skin more specifically a fact, the warmth inside it more deliberately maintained against an outside that is no longer cooperative. Nothing visible changed. The surface looks the same. The sky is the same sky. But you cross something with physical dimensions, a definite location, a temperature difference the body registers as an event. The line was there all along, invisible to everything except the body inside it. This is what it means to be in a system with gradients. The differences are real. They are experienced, not observed. The body encounters them not as data about a thing, but as the thing itself. Delivered through the skin. The line between warm and cold is not an idea. It is a location. It is somewhere you are, and then somewhere you were. The surface currents carried heat, not as metaphor, not as analogy for something else. Thermal energy, stored in the water, transported by the current across thousands of kilometers of ocean, released at the destination. The tropics receive more solar energy than they can hold. The poles receive less. Left alone, the difference would grow. The tropics hotter, the poles colder, until the extremes exceeded what anything could sustain. The currents do not solve this. They move it. The excess heat of the tropics is loaded into warm surface water and carried poleward, and the poleward atmosphere receives what the tropics sent. And the tropics cool slightly by having given it, and the poles warm slightly by receiving it. And the difference is maintained within the range the system can sustain. The current is not trying to warm anywhere. It is going where the physics sends it. The warming it produces is a consequence, not a purpose. The system does not have a purpose. It has a state, and the state has consequences. The temperature of a coastline, the navigability of a stretch of ocean, the habitability of a latitude that would otherwise be colder. None of it planned. All of it produced by a circulation that has been running since the ocean last settled into this basin. Western Europe was warmer than its latitude should have allowed, warmer than the same latitudes on the western shore of the Atlantic, on the coast of Canada, where no current brought tropical water close enough to release its heat into the atmosphere. The same sun, the same latitude, different temperature, because different water arrived offshore. The heat that kept those winters moderate had left the Gulf of Mexico months before. It traveled the length of the Atlantic to deliver itself. The system that moves heat across a planet's surface requires no awareness of what it is doing. It simply moves. And the world is different because it moves. The temperature of a coastline, the range of a species, the timing of a season in a place far from the tropics that the current reaches without knowing it is reaching it. All of it, the consequence of water moving in the direction the conditions allowed. This is what large systems produce. Conditions. Not outcomes they are trying to achieve, but conditions that emerge from the continuous interaction of their components. The system produces the conditions. The conditions produce the life. The life does not know the system. The system does not know the life. Both continue regardless. You are inside the side effects of a system that has no knowledge of itself. The warm water moves north, and the north cools it. This is where the system turns. Surface circulation becoming deep circulation, the water that was carried poleward beginning its long descent. In the Norwegian Sea, in the Labrador Sea, in the waters around Greenland, the warm surface water arriving from the south meets an atmosphere that in winter is very cold. The water is still warmer than the air. The difference causes transfer. Heat moves from warmer to colder. It does not need a mechanism or an initiating event. It is what happens when warm water is in contact with cold air. The direction of the transfer is not a decision, it is the consequence of the difference, and it proceeds at the rate the difference allows. The water releases what it carried from the tropics. As it cools, it becomes heavier. This is what cold water does. It wants depth. The cooling surface water in the North Atlantic presses progressively downward as it gives up its heat to the winter atmosphere. It sits at the surface, becoming heavier, not all at once, but continuously, the water cooling at the boundary with the air and the cooled water beginning to press into the warmer, lighter water below it. Salt adds to this. Through the long transit from the tropics, some of the water evaporated. The freshwater portion carried away as vapor into the atmosphere. The salt stayed. The water that arrives in the North Atlantic is slightly saltier than it was when it left the Gulf of Mexico, slightly saltier than the water at this latitude that has not made that transit. Salt makes seawater denser. The water arriving at the sinking sites carries both the cold of the northern atmosphere and the salt of the tropics it passed through. Two forces compounding into density, both pushing in the same direction, and at a certain threshold, it descends. Not dramatically. There is no cascade, no visible event. The dense water that was at the surface is no longer at the surface. It has begun to move downward, slowly, under its own weight, into the water below that is not yet as dense. The surface above fills in from the sides. The exchange is invisible. The mechanism produces no sound, no turbulence, no signal at the surface. This is where the deep system begins. Not with an event, with a gradient. The same continuous, invisible force that drove the surface current, now operating in a different direction. The descending water does not fall. In air, descent is fast. Gravity, little resistance, the thing is down before there is time to think about it. In water, density differences are small, and the medium resists rapid movement. The descent of the thermohaline circulation is slow in a way that removes it from any ordinary register of motion. Meters per day in the fastest regions, centimeters per day in others. The water is going down. It will take months to reach the depth it is traveling toward. You would not feel the direction, but you would feel the pressure. Each meter of descent adds the weight of the water above it, not as pain, not as force in any specific direction, but as an evenness, an equivalent pressure from every direction simultaneously. The body surrounded, held, contained, not crushed, equalized. Every surface of the skin receiving the same pressure at once, which the body reads not as compression, but as an absence of asymmetry. The feeling of being inside something rather than beside it. The descent is as invisible to the body as the descent of a year through time. Real, measurable, happening at every moment, imperceptible from inside. The descending water carries everything with it, its temperature, the temperature of the surface conditions at the moment it went under, a temperature that is already different from the surface temperature now, and will be different again from the surface temperature when it eventually returns. Its salinity, the concentration of salt accumulated through the long transit from the tropics, concentrated slightly by evaporation, by the processes of the surface. The gases it absorbed from the atmosphere, oxygen, carbon dioxide, the chemical record of the air that was in contact with it at the surface. It carries the signature of the moment it left. As it descends, it moves through water that has been at depth longer. Water with a different temperature, a different chemistry. The record of when that water went under, which may have been decades ago, or centuries ago, or longer. The layers of water at different depths are layers of different times. The same basin, the same ocean, stratified into a sequence of eras. Each layer the chemical record of a different surface, a different sky, a different set of conditions at the moment that water left the sunlight. You move through all of them on the way down. The water from last century, the water from 3 centuries ago, the water from 5 centuries ago, still carrying the oxygen levels of the atmosphere in a pre-industrial world, the carbon concentrations of a different era's burning, the isotopic signatures of a climate the living world above had already left behind. All of them present. All of them real. All of them still moving in the slow drift of the deep toward the region where they will eventually rise. The ocean at depth is stratified into history, going deeper. At depth, the motion continues. Not the motion of wind-driven surface currents, not the motion of the descending thermohaline water in the upper ocean. Deep motion, slow motion. The kind of motion that takes centuries to complete a single circuit of the ocean, that operates below the level at which anything experiences duration. The water that formed in the cold of the North Atlantic sinks and begins to move south, along the deep floor of the Atlantic, guided by the basin's topography, by the ridges and channels and seamount ranges that direct the motion of water too dense to rise, too dense to simply stop. It moves south toward the Antarctic. At the Antarctic shelf, the coldest and densest water in the ocean forms. The water in contact with the ice of Antarctica, cooled to near freezing, made heavy by the salt concentration of Antarctic surface water, sinks to the very floor of the ocean and begins to spread. This water, Antarctic bottom water, is the densest naturally occurring seawater on Earth under the current conditions of the planet. It settles to the bottom and moves north, along the floor of the Atlantic, the Pacific, the Indian Ocean. The floor of the entire connected ocean covered in a slow drift of the densest water, carrying the signature of the Antarctic surface, moving in the dark at the pace of centuries. The entire connected floor of the ocean in slow, cold, continuous drift, carrying the signature of the conditions that made it in the dark toward regions it will not reach for centuries. The deep water moves. It has been moving. There is no point at which it stops and no point at which it arrives. Only the continuing, the direction maintained, the physics of cold water in a deep basin doing what cold water in a deep basin does, the water going where it goes. Months pass, years pass, decades. The water descending today will still be moving when the season that is currently at the surface has been gone for a generation. The water that entered the deep a century ago is still in the deep, still in transit, still carrying the chemical record of its era, still moving along the floor of the ocean at the pace that cold, dense water moves along the floors of oceans. Not approaching arrival, not building toward anything, simply in the direction, at the depth, at the temperature the deep maintains regardless of what the surface above it is doing. It is dark here, not the dark of a night that ends, the dark of a depth that has no day, not since the water went under, which may have been before anyone alive was born, before their parents were born, before the grandparents of those parents were born. The dark is not an absence. It is the condition of the depth, as constant as the cold, as structural as the direction. The water moves through it. Decades accumulate above the deep. Centuries accumulate above the deep. The organisms living at the surface are born and die. Not one generation, but many. Not one century, but several. The seasons cycle above the deep. The ice forms in the north and retreats and forms again. The surface temperature shifts with the variations of the climate. None of this reaches the deep in any immediate sense. The deep is insulated from the surface by all the layers that separate them. What is happening at the surface now will enter the deep eventually, will arrive as a different water mass in a different century, carrying the signature of conditions that will by then be historical, but not yet, not for a very long time. Meanwhile, the deep water moves, still carrying the record of the moment it went under, still in transit, still in the direction the conditions required when the direction was established. Nothing here is trying. It moves and continues moving and does not arrive. Nothing here moves at any rate the body would register. You would have to wait, not hours, not days, but years, to notice you had traveled. The current is real. Its velocity is real. It is operating at a time scale that removes it entirely from the experience of motion. There is no sensation of going. There is no reference to measure against. There is only the water and the direction already in it, and the slow proceeding of the direction, like the voyage, real movement, no sensation of moving. The deep and the vessel share this, not as metaphor, as structural similarity. Both systems move at the pace the physics allows. Both carry what was sealed into them when they began. Both are proceeding toward a return that is real, that is already happening, that no one inside is required to feel in order for it to continue. The full circuit of the ocean's circulation is one loop, not a loop in the geometric sense. A circle, a closed shape with a beginning and an end that are the same point. A loop in the sense that a weather system is a loop, a continuous connected flow in which material circulates through the same pathways, in which what goes in one direction is the same material that went in a different direction some centuries before, in which the question of beginning has no answer, because the whole thing has been running long enough that origin no longer applies. Water sinks in the North Atlantic, moves south along the deep Atlantic floor, enters the deep Southern Ocean, spreads east and north into the deep Pacific and deep Indian Ocean. And there, over centuries, in specific regions where the surface layers are thin enough, where the density gradient allows it, where the wind-driven surface circulation has pushed enough water away that deep water can rise to fill the gap. The deep water slowly returns to the surface. It arrives not where it left, not even in the same ocean. Water that sank in the North Atlantic rises in the Pacific thousands of kilometers from where it descended, carrying what it accumulated in the centuries between, the cold, the chemistry, the nutrients of the deep, back to where sunlight reaches, back into contact with the sky. It begins again. The same water, not literally the same molecules, because the ocean mixes and the boundaries between water masses blur over time, but the same system, the same loop, completing its next turn. The water that is descending in the North Atlantic today will arrive at the surface of the Pacific centuries from now. The water rising in the Pacific today went under in a previous century. The loop does not end because the drivers that run it, the temperature difference between tropics and poles, the salinity contrasts, the rotation of the planet, do not resolve, they continue. And the loop continues because they continue. The loop is not sustained by any effort. It is sustained by the persistence of the conditions that produce it. The sun keeps arriving at the tropics at greater intensity than at the poles. The planet keeps rotating. The ocean keeps occupying its basin. As long as these things are true, the loop runs. The loop does not need to be maintained. It needs only to be in conditions. The conditions persist. The loop persists. You are inside a loop that has no end and no beginning. That simply is. The surface currents do not move in straight lines. The rotation of the Earth deflects everything that moves horizontally across its surface. Air, water, anything traveling across the planet without anchoring to the ground beneath it. In the northern hemisphere, the deflection is to the right. In the southern, to the left. This is continuous, and it shapes every current in every ocean. Over hundreds of kilometers, the deflected surface currents curve into circles. The circles are called gyres. The North Atlantic gyre is approximately the size of a continent. The Gulf Stream runs up its western edge. The North Atlantic current crosses its top, moving east. The Canary Current descends its eastern edge, carrying cooler water south. The North Atlantic Equatorial Current crosses its bottom, heading west. The water circulates. The gyre turns. It has been turning for longer than any human institution that has ever existed. At the center of the gyre, the water is nearly still. The turning of the edges creates, at the center, a region of convergence. Water accumulating, sinking very slowly, generating at the surface a calm that is both real and strange. The Sargasso Sea occupies this center. It is the only sea on Earth with no land borders. Its borders are the currents of the gyre itself, the moving water that defines the edge of the system and holds the stillness within. What enters the Sargasso Sea does not leave easily. Nothing carries things out. The inward curl of the gyre brings things to the center and leaves them there. Floating sargassum seaweed accumulates in dense mats at the surface, found in no other ocean, carried inward by the motion of the gyre over enough time that the animals living in the sargassum evolved specifically to live there. Found nowhere else. Shaped by the particular stillness and warmth of the place the gyre made, nothing moves. Everything is circling. The center of the largest circulation system on the surface of the Atlantic is the quietest water in the ocean. The motion that defines the system is entirely at its edges. The center is held still by the motion around it. The stillness is not passive, it is produced. The outcome of four currents pressing inward from every direction, their motion arriving from all sides, colliding at the center, and resolving into calm. The calm is not what happens when the motion stops. It is what happens when motion is balanced from every direction simultaneously. Four forces pressing inward, nothing pressing out. The result is not the absence of force, but the cancellation of force, which looks the same from the inside. Still water, barely moving, warm and clear, but is something entirely different in origin. What the edges cannot hold, the gyre sends to the center, not by intention, by physics. The inward curve of each current, the same Coriolis deflection that formed the gyre, carries what it holds slightly toward the interior. Once at the center, nothing carries it back. There is no outward current, no return path from the center to the edges. The center has no outflow. What arrives stays. The Sargasso does not collect what it chose. It holds what the gyre could not carry past it. Over time, this accumulates, not quickly. The Sargasso is not a place of rapid change. It is a place of slow consistency, of conditions that persist because the surrounding motion maintains them, of accumulation that happens at the pace of the gyre's turning. The sargassum builds over seasons and decades. The specific warmth, the specific clarity, the specific low-nutrient stillness of the place establish themselves and hold. And life responds to the holding, not to the warmth alone, which exists in other places, not to the clarity alone, which exists in other places, to this specific combination. Warmth and stillness, and the particular chemical composition that the surrounding motion maintains at the center, in no other configuration anywhere else in the ocean. The organisms that evolved in the sargassum are not found in the open ocean beyond it. They are found here, in this specific product of this specific gyre's motion, in the place that motion made. That motion maintains. That motion will unmake only if the gyre unmakes. The center of a large system does not share the character of its edges. The edges of the North Atlantic gyre are dynamic. Temperature fronts, biological abundance, the collision of water masses pressing against each other. The center is warm, still, clear, poor in nutrients, specific in a way that the edges are not. The desert at the center of the turning, not empty. The sargassum is dense, the ecology deep, the conditions highly particular. But a different kind of place from what the motion at the edges suggests is possible. The gyre produces its own interior. The motion produces the stillness. The turning produces the held. The water moving through the thermohaline circulation today is old. Not in the geological sense. Old in human terms. The deep water circulating through the Pacific has been out of contact with the surface for 500 years, perhaps longer. The surface it left was the surface of a different world. Different atmospheric chemistry, different temperatures, different ships or no ships at all in parts of the ocean too far from anywhere. The water carries none of this as memory. It carries it as chemistry. The gas concentrations of its era are in it. The isotopic ratios, the trace elements of the conditions at the surface when it formed, the oxygen content of an atmosphere that has since changed. Scientists learned to read these signatures and calculate when the water was last at the surface, what conditions it formed under, how long it has been in the dark. The water does not know what it carries. It simply carries. This is what it means for a system to remember without experiencing. The record is in the material, not chosen, not curated, simply retained because the conditions of the deep prevented the chemistry of change from proceeding. The same principle the Arctic ice demonstrated, but in liquid form, moving, carrying its record across an ocean floor in the dark for centuries. The record travels with the system without the system having to maintain it. The system maintains its state, its temperature gradients, its salinity contrasts, its density differences, and the water circulates through that state without the system ever needing to know itself. The loop runs because the conditions that run it continue. The direction is a property of the conditions. The water inherits the direction. The direction was there before any particular water entered the system and will be there after it has moved through. There is no first drop. There is no origin. The loop has been running since the ocean settled into this basin, and before that it ran differently, in different basins, when the continents were different shapes and the ocean had different boundaries, and the circulation found the paths those boundaries allowed. The system finds its path. It always finds a path. The path changes when the conditions change. While the conditions hold, the path holds, and the water in the path goes where the path goes. You are in a system without a beginning, moving in a direction you did not create, going where the system is going. The current moves more than water. Carbon dissolves in cold water more readily than in warm. When the surface water of the North Atlantic cools and descends, it carries dissolved carbon into the deep ocean, where it will remain for the centuries of the thermohaline circuit. The ocean is pulling carbon out of the atmosphere continuously, at the rate the circulation and the biology and the temperature allow, storing it in the deep where the conditions do not allow it to return quickly. Oxygen travels the same path. The surface ocean, in contact with the atmosphere, absorbs oxygen and carries it down with the descending thermohaline water. The deep ocean breathes through the circulation, inhaling at the surface and delivering oxygen to depths where no light reaches, where no photosynthesis occurs, where living things depend on what the circulation sent down from the surface centuries before. The breath of the ocean is centuries long. Nutrients follow. The biological organisms at the surface take up nutrients, build themselves, die, sink. Their remains carry phosphorus and nitrogen and iron into the deep, where the chemistry of decomposition releases them slowly into the surrounding water. The circulation carries these nutrients through the deep pathways and eventually returns them to the surface in upwelling regions, where they feed the blooms that feed the chains that feed everything above them. The surface is fertile because of what the deep sent up. The deep is oxygenated because of what the surface sent down. There is no part of the ocean that sustains itself. Every part depends on what the rest of the system provides. What came from somewhere else, what has been traveling toward this place for decades or centuries, what will arrive when the current delivers it. The coral reef depends on nutrients carried by currents from thousands of kilometers away. The deep-sea organism depends on oxygen that descended from the surface in a previous century. The tropical surface depends on the deep water that will upwell here and feed the next bloom. Nothing in the ocean stays where it starts. Everything passes through the whole system before it arrives anywhere. The ocean is not a set of places, it is a set of pathways. Everything in it is already in motion towards somewhere else. The deep water returns. In specific regions, in the Pacific, along the equator, along coasts where the wind drives surface water away and deep water rises to fill the space. The thermohaline water completes its ascent, not dramatically. The upwelling is the mirror of the descent, slow, invisible, continuous. The surface shows nothing. The water arrives from below at the rate the surface water moved away. It arrives cold, cold in the way that the deep ocean is cold. Not the cold of a winter day, but the cold of depth, of having been far from sunlight for centuries. It carries everything it accumulated in the dark. The nutrients, the biology of the surface used up, and the deep has spent centuries concentrating, the oxygen loaded at the surface in a previous era, the chemical signatures of the conditions when it descended. The most productive surfaces in the ocean are where upwelling is strongest, not because upwelling brings warmth. The upwelling water is cold, because it brings what the surface can no longer produce for itself, the fertility of the deep accumulated in the dark over centuries of slow transit. The cold water arrives and the surface blooms, green in the satellite images of upwelling zones, the color of biological abundance, fed by what spent centuries in the dark on its way back. The cold arrives before the light reaches it. For a moment, the upwelling water is at the surface, but still cold, still carrying the temperature of depth, still dense, still the water it was in the dark. The sun will warm it, the surface currents will take it, the evaporation will begin, but for a moment it is cold water at the surface, arriving from below, completing a circuit that began in a century that is gone. Nothing was diminished in the time away. The water returns carrying what it was given. The loop does not consume what moves through it, it carries. And what it carries arrives at the surface in the condition the deep preserved. Cold, dense, rich, ready to become part of the surface again, ready to be warmed and evaporated and carried poleward and cooled and sent under again. The return is not the end, it is the beginning of the next circuit. Return now to the body, to the chamber, to the dark, to the particular stillness of the space you are in, which is not the stillness of the deep ocean, which moves, but the stillness of a vessel in transit, which is also moving, which has also been moving since before you entered it. The ocean covered more than 70% of the surface of old Earth, not as approximation, as fact of the basin. The shape of the land that was above the water defined the shape of the water, which covered the rest. 70% of the only surface there was. The land was the exception, the ocean was the condition, and the ocean moved continuously at every depth and every latitude, not at the same rate or in the same direction or on the same time scale. The surface moved on the scale of days and years. The deep moved on the scale of centuries. The gyres turned on the scale of decades. The thermohaline loop completed on the scale of 1,000 years. All of them simultaneous. All of them the same water, participating in each scale and sequence as it moved from surface to deep to surface again. You are in motion now, not the motion of the ocean, the motion of the voyage, happening at a pace below the ordinary register of movement, at a pace that does not feel like motion from inside. that does not announce itself to any sense the body uses to track change. But the direction is established. It was established before you entered the cryo chamber. It exists in the physics of the mission. Unicity, in the accumulated velocity, in the orientation of the vessel, in the distance growing between origin and the distance slowly closing toward destination. The direction does not require your awareness to continue. It requires only that you remain in the system that is carrying you, which you are. The Gulf Stream does not know it is the Gulf Stream. The water moving through the thermohaline circulation does not know it is completing a loop. It moves in the direction the conditions allow, in the direction the temperature and the salinity and the shape of the basin and the rotation of the planet require. And the direction is a property of the conditions, not of the water. The water inherits it. The direction was there before the water arrived and will be there after the water has moved through. You inherited the direction. The current does not require you to understand it. The water in the Gulf Stream does not know it is carrying tropical heat toward the European coastline, does not know that its eventual descent in the Norwegian Sea will drive the thermohaline circulation for decades. It simply moves. And where it moves, the system requires it to move. And what it carries, the system delivers. You are what the system is carrying. The deep water at the bottom of the Pacific is not waiting to return to the surface. It is not accumulating patience. It does not experience the 500 years of its transit as duration. It is simply moving at the rate the system allows, in the direction the density gradient and the basin and the current state of the circulation require. The return is not an event it is working toward. The return is where the current goes next, and the current goes there because that's what the current does. You are where the current goes next. The direction is in the medium, not in any individual drop, not in any single current or gyre or loop. In the relationship between all of it, the temperature and the salinity and the density and the rotation and the basin and the difference between tropics and poles that drives everything. The direction is a property of the conditions, and the conditions have been producing it for longer than anything alive on the planet when you left. The current is already running. You are in it. You were never outside the system. You do not need to swim. The archive record for ocean current systems is now complete for this transmission. The ocean of old Earth moved as a single connected system. Warm surface currents carrying heat poleward, cooling and sinking, moving through the deep ocean at the pace of centuries, rising again in upwelling regions, completing a loop that no beginning can be assigned to and no end anticipated. The surface fertile from what the deep returned. The deep oxygenated from what the surface sent down. The gyres turning, each one enclosing at its center the stillest water in the ocean, held still by the motion surrounding it. The direction is in the system, not in any water that passes through it. In the relationship between the conditions that produce continuously the same pathways, the same loop, the same direction that has been running since the ocean settled into its current form. You are inside that logic. Not the ocean, the logic. The conditions that produce circulation in systems of sufficient scale and patience produce the same structure everywhere. Direction without decision, movement without urgency, a loop that runs because the drivers that run it have not resolved and will not resolve, and the loop continues. The current does not end. It does not know it is a current. It does not know it is running or carrying or completing a loop. It simply is in the conditions, and the conditions produce the direction, and the direction continues. You do not need to be separate from what carries you. The water does not ride the current. It is the current. The warm surface water is the Gulf Stream. The cold descending water is the thermohaline circulation. The deep water moving along the floor of the Atlantic is the deep circulation. The system and the water are not two things. They are the same thing, in motion, proceeding in the direction the conditions allow. Rest now. You are of the current. There was never anything else. Sleep ship archive. Transmission complete. Vessel status stable. Cryosleep monitoring nominal. All systems nominal. Archive records sealed and filed. Voyage continues. Please continue restorative sleep.